Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 10. It was at the grand old age of 13 that I ditched history in secondary school, hoping never to return to the subject again. As someone who was more interested in the scientific developments of the future, I couldn't see any point whatsoever in studying the past. And you'll be relieved to hear that my appreciation of history has changed a little since then, because as an American philosopher of the last century called George Santayana once said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That is why history is so important. And that is why biblical history is so important. That's certainly what the Apostle Paul thought. Did you notice the first part of 1 Corinthians 10? It's all about history. The chapter begins, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers." And what you have in the following verses is a summary of a long period of Old Testament history. Now, don't forget that Paul is writing this letter to a predominantly Gentile church in the first century Greek city of Corinth. It didn't get much more Gentile than Corinth, and yet he describes those people from the Old Testament era as our forefathers. In what sense could the Israelites of Old Testament history be described as the forefathers of thoroughly Gentile people like the Corinthians or like us? They are our forefathers in the faith. Because as Paul makes clear elsewhere, the true descendants of those Old Testament Israelites, as far as God is concerned, the true descendants of those Old Testament Israelites is not the ethnic Jews of today, but rather the Christian believer of today. If you belong to Christ, says Paul at the close of Galatians 3, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And therefore, when we read Old Testament history, we must not forget that what we are reading is our history. Our history. It's our history as the people of God. And what Paul does in this 10th chapter is teach us some very important lessons from our history. And the first of those lessons is in verses 1 to 5, and there we have a lesson concerning complacency. A lesson concerning complacency. Now, if you were with us last week, then you may remember that in the closing verses of chapter 9, Paul highlighted the need for self-denial and self-discipline in the Christian life. And he described that necessity in chapter 9, verse 27, the closing verse, as, "I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." And on hearing that, you may have thought to yourself, "Oh, come on, Paul. Come on. Surely you don't need to worry about being disqualified from the Christian life. After all, you've had some great spiritual experiences over the years, and you've possessed some remarkable spiritual gifts. One of the greatest theologians the church has ever known. If anyone can assume that they are home and dry and heading for heaven regardless, then surely it's you, Paul." And what you may have thought about the Apostle Paul is perhaps what some of the Corinthians were thinking about themselves. They too claim to have had some remarkable experiences in the past. They too claim to possess some remarkable gifts, and consequently they were perhaps in danger of thinking that all this talk about the need for discipline and self-denial in the Christian life was a little bit OTT, which being interpreted is over the top. We're spiritually safe, eternally secure, they perhaps thought to themselves. And so rather than bother about such inconveniences as self-denial and self-discipline, surely we can now live as we want and do as we please in the Christian life. And it was a challenge to such complacency. In order to challenge such complacency, that Paul now draws their attention and our attention to the experience of those Israelites that came out of Egypt with Moses in the book of Exodus, as translated in the NIV and not the ESV this time. Chapter 10 begins with the word "for," indicating that what we have in these verses is a continuation of the argument at the close of chapter 9. It is a continuation in that Paul is now providing examples from our history of people who, closing words of verse 9, were disqualified for the prize. He's going to provide us with some examples of people for whom that frightening description was a reality. Having celebrated that original Passover, the Israelites, you may remember, fled from the tyranny of Pharaoh. And as they did so, they were a pillar of cloud led them during the day, a pillar of fire led them by night. As they got to the Red Sea, God miraculously separated the waters and led them through on dry ground. They did so, you may remember, under the leadership of Moses. They were closely identified with Moses, so much so that Paul says that they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Interestingly, they remained bone dry throughout the whole process, not even a sprinkling of water, let alone a full immersion, and yet their relationship to Moses was of such a nature that they're described as being baptized into Moses. That's how strong their identification with God's man and God's people was. And having come through the sea with Moses, they were then miraculously provided for on a daily basis with water and food. Paul describes those provisions as spiritual food and spiritual drink to emphasize two things. Firstly, to emphasize that the manna and the water were not natural phenomena, but rather things which were supernaturally provided by God. Secondly, the food and the drink are described as being spiritual, in that they were not merely given as a means of meeting physical needs and sustaining physical strength. They were also given as a means of sustaining spiritual health, spiritual strength. That supernatural provision by God ought to have strengthened and maintained the people's faith in God. And please note, what is said in these verses was not only true of a few elite, super spiritual Israelites who came out of Egypt. Did you notice how many times the word "all" appears? They were all under the cloud, verse 1. They all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses, verse 2. They all ate, verse 3. And what they all ate was the same spiritual food and the same spiritual drink. Here was a people who collectively, not exceptions, collectively, they had experienced remarkable things and enjoyed enormous privileges and enormous blessings from God. Nevertheless, verse 5, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. In other words, they never reached the promised land. Isn't that tragic? To use the language of chapter 9, verse 27, they were disqualified for the prize. In spite of all the blessings and privileges they had known, in spite of the tremendous things that they had witnessed and experienced, they never made it. And their tragic history provides the Corinthians and us with an important lesson on complacency. An important lesson on complacency. Now, don't forget that this passage occurs within the context of chapters 8 to 10, which is all about Christian freedom, Christian liberty of conscience. But from what Paul says here in this 10th chapter, it appears that some within the Corinthian church were in danger of confusing liberty with license. A license to do as you want. A license to live as you please. And if you had asked them why they thought it was okay to do so, they would have pointed to their baptism. They would have pointed to their place amongst the people of God on a Sunday and possibly during the week. They would have talked about their past experiences of God, the blessings and gifts that they received from God, and so on. We are God's people, they would have said, and therefore we are now safe and secure. Regardless of what we do, regardless of how we live. And it may just be that that is our attitude this morning. We've become complacent about our Christianity. We assume that because of a past commitment of some kind, a past profession of faith many years ago, or perhaps because of our baptism or our regular attendance at church on a Sunday morning, or what we perceive to be spiritual blessings and spiritual gifts, it may just be that as a result of those things, we assume that we are home and dry as far as our future place in heaven is concerned, and therefore it doesn't matter how we live our lives in the present. If that is what we think this morning, then like the Corinthians, then we too need to pay attention to this lesson from history that God has provided us with, because it is an important lesson from a previous generation of God's people who likewise had become complacent. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, oh, but preacher, you've forgotten something that's blatantly obvious. I don't know how you didn't see it, David. You've forgotten something. What you've forgotten is that that was Old Testament history. We are now New Testament Christians. We have Jesus now. And that means that our salvation is much more secure than theirs was, and therefore, unlike them, we can afford to be complacent. Can we? Did you notice what Paul said in verse 4? They drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Oh yes, they too had Christ in one sense. Just as Jesus was described in chapter 8, verse 6 as the mediator of God's creating work in history, so Paul wants to emphasize here in chapter 10 that Jesus has been the mediator of God's redeeming work throughout history. Although living several thousand years prior to the coming of Christ, it was nevertheless through Christ that they received those daily spiritual blessings from God. They too had Jesus with them. and yet they never made it to the promised land. And therefore, regardless of whether we live in BC or AD, we must be careful that we do not confuse liberty of conscience with a license to sin. Because history demonstrates that that is a fatal mistake to make. Fatal mistake. Regardless of past experiences, regardless of present privileges, our history demonstrates that there is no place for such complacency amongst those who profess to be the people of God. Moving on, secondly, the next thing that Paul gives us from our history is a warning concerning sin. A warning concerning sin. Now, if you still have doubts about the relevance of Old Testament history for our experience today, then just listen to what Paul says in verse 6. He says, now these things occurred. What things? He's referring to those things that occurred away back in Old Testament times. These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And what sort of evil things did they set their hearts on back then? Well, Paul lists 4 of them from verse 7 through to verse 10. His list is by no means exhaustive. You could think of other examples of evil things that people did in the Old Testament. But Paul selects 4 examples which, did you notice, would have been particularly relevant for the Corinthians. For example, first on Paul's list, not surprisingly, idolatry. Verse 7, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. Those words are a quotation of Exodus 32, verse 6, a chapter that records one of the most outrageous occurrences of idolatry in all of Old Testament history. Old Testament history is full of cases of idolatry, but none of it gets more outrageous or blatant than Exodus 32. Why do I say that? Well, what we have to remember is that Exodus 32 is within a short space of time, a very short space of time, of their deliverance from Egypt. And while Moses is still up Mount Sinai receiving God's law, they've just experienced their miraculous deliverance from Egypt. Their leader is up the mountain, communion with God. And what do? They resort to the worship of a golden calf. That's what they did. They made a golden statue in the shape of a calf, and they bowed down to it. Do you see now why God was not pleased with them? And why they never made it to the promised land? Idolatry. So learn the lessons of history, says Paul in verse 7, and do not be idolaters, as some of them were. Second evil thing on Paul's list, and again, not surprisingly, in view of the fact that he's writing to the church in Corinth, is verse 8. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. That occasion is recorded in Numbers 25, where we are told that the Israelite men indulged in sexual immorality with Moabite women, the result being that Israel worshipped a false pagan god called Baal. And we are told in that passage, the Lord's anger burned against them, resulting in the death of over 20,000 Israelites. Third evil on Paul's list, verse 9. We should not test the Lord as some of them did and were killed by snakes. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound a little bit familiar to you? It may well do, because that's a reference to the passage in Numbers 21 that we read earlier. The Israelites spoke out against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread, there's no water. We detest this miserable food. They were treating with contempt God's goodness to them, both in his initial deliverance from Egypt and in his ongoing provision. And as a result, many Israelites died of snake bites in the wilderness. Fourth evil, verse 10, is do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. It's probably referring to an incident recorded for us in Numbers 16, where some of the Israelites rebelled against God's authority over them, and we are told fire came out from the Lord and consumed 25 of them. 250 of them who were offering the incense. That's our history. 4 instances from our history that show that the very people who were rescued and redeemed from Egypt, the very people who enjoyed all those spiritual blessings throughout their journey, those are the very same people who returned to idolatry and immorality. Those are the very same people who treated the goodness of God with contempt and rebelled against the authority of God. And here is the point. Those were the very same people who suffered the wrath and judgment of God. Please note their past experience of God's goodness in his deliverance from Egypt, and their continuing experience of God's blessings day by day did not make them exempt from divine judgment. Having resorted to a life of idolatry and immorality, having demonstrated rebellion and contempt, they aroused the Lord's anger, and in doing so suffered the frightening consequences. That is a warning from our history concerning sin. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, but David, you've forgotten it again. You've made an obvious blunder yet again. Because what you've forgotten is that is what the God of the Old Testament was like. He was always angry back in those days. But he's no longer like that. We are trusting in the God of the New Testament, and therefore we don't need to worry about him responding to our sin in that way. Don't you believe it? There is not two gods in the Bible, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. There is one God, and he is the unchanging God. And it is because his hatred of sin is the same today as it was back then that Paul is reminding us of God's response to their evil and wicked behaviour back then. The reason their bitter experience of God's judgment is recorded for us here in 1 Corinthians 10, the reason Paul goes to all this length to record it for us in detail is not so that you and I will shrug it off as being the God of the Old Testament. No, the reason it is recorded is so that the Corinthians and you and me might sit up and take note and learn the solemn and frightening lessons of history. These things happened to them, verse 11, as examples and were written down as warnings for us. In other words, says Paul, learn the lessons of history. Don't do what they did. Because if history teaches you anything, it teaches you that such actions and such behaviour leads to disastrous consequences. If the Corinthians or us, many years later, if we still needed convincing that there's no room for complacency, then surely this is it not? If we still want proof that those who profess to be the people of God cannot do what they want or live any old way they like, then surely this is it not? Regardless of past experiences, regardless of present privileges, we cannot and dare not live a life of blatant and deliberate, persistent and continual sin and expect to get away with it. That is the warning that the Corinthians needed to take from Old Testament history back then. And that is the warning that you and I still need to take from our history today. We've seen a lesson concerning complacency. We've seen a warning concerning sin. Thirdly and finally, verses 12 and 13, and there we have a comfort concerning temptation. A comfort concerning temptation. Now, having told us in this passage about the experience of those who profess to be the people of God in a previous generation, Paul turns his attention at the close of verse 11 to those who profess to be the people of God in this generation, and he describes us, did you notice how he describes us? He describes us as those on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Or as the ESV says, on whom the end of the ages has come. And what that little phrase demonstrates, firstly, is that world history is neither endless, nor meaningless, nor circular. Instead, it is linear, it has a starting point, and it's travelling towards an end point. And living when we do, you and I have the privilege of living in both the final and the greatest period of world history. Do you realise that? It is the final era in that the next big event to occur is the return of Jesus Christ and the end of world history as we know it. And that is why the New Testament writers refer to the period between the first and second coming of Jesus as the last days. They refer to it in New Testament times as the last days, and 2,000 years later we continue to live in the last days. But it's not only the final era of world history, it's also the greatest era of world history that we live in that everything that happened BC was pointing forward and preparing the way for this era that you and I call AD. And although God was at work in remarkable ways throughout the Old Testament era, as we've seen this morning, the coming of Jesus Christ to this earth 2,000 years ago saw God work in even greater ways. For example, whereas in the past God had spoken through the prophets at many times and in various ways, to quote Hebrews 1 verse 1, with the coming of Jesus 2,000 years ago, God was now speaking to us. God was now revealing himself to us in the person of his Son. Whereas in the past God had provided powerful examples and vivid illustrations of redemption, as we see particularly in the Exodus, with the coming of Jesus 2,000 years ago, God's rescuing and redeeming work in this world reached its climax. It reached its climax in the death of Jesus, because there upon the cross, Jesus was fully and finally securing the eternal redemption of all who put their trust in him. Whereas in the past, God's Spirit was given to specific people for a time in order to fulfill specific tasks, everyone who puts their faith and trust in Jesus Christ is now indwelt by the Holy Spirit of God. Those are just some of the privileges that we enjoy as those on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come, to quote the words of verse 11. Living when we do, we live in an era of enormous privilege. We can look back and see what God has done in the history of our world in order to rescue sinners like you and me from the deserved consequences of our sin. His work of redemption is much clearer now than it ever was in Old Testament times. He has sent his Son to die in the sinner's place, and through trusting in what Jesus has done, you and I can have our sins forgiven and be assured of a place in heaven. But please not. Please not. None of those great privileges that I've listed as a result of living in this present era, none of those great privileges make the warnings of Old Testament history redundant or irrelevant. None of them. And the reason I say that is because, as we've discovered this morning, there is a vast difference between an assurance about those things that I've mentioned and a complacency about those things. A vast difference. And that is why Paul has given us those warnings from Old Testament history. And that is why he goes on to say in verse 12, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful. Be careful that you don't fall. As we have seen in chapter 8, there were some within the church at Corinth who had a weak conscience. But what that also means is that there were others who had a stronger conscience. Christians who had no qualms about doing this, that, and the next thing. In chapter 9, we've heard Paul speak about becoming all things to all men for the sake of the gospel, and those with a stronger conscience perhaps found that easier to implement than others, in that they would have no qualms about doing some of the things the unbelieving people around them did. But the danger that such people found themselves in, and still do, is that our liberty of conscience is perhaps sometimes in danger of becoming a license to sin. And our eagerness to become like the unbeliever for the sake of the gospel can so easily result in us imbibing the worldly ethos and the sinful habits of an unbelieving world. And it is to such people like us, people with a strong conscience, people who have no qualms about doing this and that and the next thing, or going here, there, and it's to people like us that Paul has to issue the warning in verse 12. If you think you're standing firm. It's one thing to have a strong conscience. It's another thing to be complacent. If you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. That is the solemn warning concerning temptation that the history of Old Testament Israel presents us with. But thankfully, there is not only a warning concerning temptation, there is also great comfort concerning temptation in these verses. And that comfort comes in two ways. Firstly, verse 13, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. In other words, the temptations to sin that you and I face, they are not unique to us. We sometimes think that no one else has ever been tempted to sin in the same way or to the same extent as we are. We sometimes think that, do we not? We sometimes feel that. But that is not true, says Paul. Other Christians experience similar temptations to you. Previous generations of God's people have faced those very same temptations, as we've discovered this morning from Old Testament history. There's many things has changed in the world, but the nature of sin and the nature of temptation hasn't changed one bit. The temptations that you and I face is the same temptations that the people of God have faced all throughout history. And that's why their experience back then is so relevant to us today. But what we also need to remember from Old Testament history is that however fierce the temptations in this world may be, not everyone back then succumbed to a life of idolatry or immorality. Did they? No. You read Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 tells us about men and women who continued living for God in spite of the great temptations they faced. They didn't fall. They continued living for God, and the reason they were able to do so is because they continued living by faith. They continued trusting in God and in the promises of God, and in doing so demonstrated not so much their faithfulness to God as God's faithfulness to them. And the second great encouragement that we have here in verse 13 is that our God hasn't changed. He's not only unchanging in his hatred of sin, he's also unchanging in his faithfulness to his people. God continues to be a faithful God, and as such he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. The picture is of an army that has been hunted and hounded by enemy forces. Is that how you sometimes feel with temptation? Hunted and hounded by enemy forces and ends up being trapped in mountainous terrain. They're surrounded by enemies on one side and mountains on the other side. Defeat seems inevitable and would be inevitable, but for a little path through the mountains by which they can escape. And likewise, says Paul, God in his faithfulness, however fierce the temptation may be, God in his faithfulness will provide you and I with a way out of temptation. Or not in the sense that the temptation will necessarily disappear altogether overnight, but rather in the sense that he will give the grace and the help and the strength and the circumstances that are necessary to resist that temptation. But please note, that does not mean that we can now become casual or complacent about temptation, because we mustn't. And that is why, if you just glance forward to the very next verse, having told us that God is faithful and he will provide a way out so that we can stand up under it, what does he say in the very next verse? He tells us to flee from idolatry. And that is why we are told back in chapter 6 to flee from sexual immorality. Verse 13 does not allow us to become casual or complacent regarding sin. But what does verse 13 does assure us of is that as we flee from such temptations, God in his faithfulness will provide us with a way out so that we can continue standing rather than falling, so that we can continue living for God. Three things Paul provides us with in the first half of 1 Corinthians 10. Firstly, we saw a lesson concerning complacency. Secondly, a warning concerning sin. And thirdly, a comfort concerning temptation.